To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith, I pay homage. And this verse that recollects the core teachings of Buddhism, as we recite this, just reinforce your own desire to follow these three main points that are here. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So then this next verse is from the Vajrakuta Sutra. We're studying emptiness right now and this perfection of wisdom, this sixth perfection. So many of these have to do with kind of the impermanent nature of things, but a number of these we can also see as signs of emptiness, that when we see particular things appearing, that there's a level of deception going on. I won't go into a whole description of each of these, but this is the purpose of reciting this, is to recall emptiness and impermanence, and to therefore let go of some of our grasping at ourselves and the world around us in the way that ignorance does. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Then a short dedication verse. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. We do the short mandala offering, again, to create some positive energy, some merit, to receive these teachings and to receive the guidance from our gurus, so we can imagine them as the recipients of this vast pure offering. And again, just visualize as best as you can the entire phenomenal world transformed into a pure land. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge and bodhicitta, bringing these two thoughts to mind as we recite this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gi pe sanam gi dola penchir sangye dupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chunyan Gi Pe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, thank you, Mary. Let's do a short meditation as usual, just to give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, let go of distractions that we might have. And then after that, I'll lead you in a short reflection to refresh our bodhicitta motivation for today. So again, just meditate on the breath for the first few minutes, or whatever object you would like to do the meditation on. Just try to stay single-pointedly focused as best as you can. When the mind wanders and you see that, gently guide the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the bell to begin this short period of silent meditation. And again, I'll come in to lead motivation in a few minutes. So now let's turn our attention towards generating our motivation of bodhicitta, and recall that compassion, especially great compassion, is the root of bodhicitta. Compassion being the wish that sentient beings not suffer, and great compassion being the desire to do something about that, to actually liberate those beings from suffering. So in his text, the supplement to the Middle Way, Master Chandrakirti spells out 3 types of compassion that are in line with these teachings that we're going through currently. And the first level of compassion is simply observing sentient beings qualified by their suffering, seeing that sentient beings are suffering, again recalling how there's the grosser levels of sufferings that we can easily identify. But then there's the fact that also even what is pleasurable that is experienced by sentient beings isn't in the nature of true happiness. It's transitory. It doesn't ultimately satisfy. It can even lead to pain, suffering. But moreover, all sentient beings are trapped in samsara under the control of their karma, their delusions, no matter what their situation is in samsara. As we saw in this class earlier, they are dealing with the root of ignorance. As long as that root of ignorance is in their minds, they will continue to have states of mind that are together with that produce the variety of experiences within samsara through our actions, our karma. This is a condition that all beings are in. So at this first level, we simply observe sentient beings and generate a compassionate wish to benefit them because we see that they are suffering. We acknowledge their suffering. So just take a moment to focus on that. And then the next level of compassion that Chandrakirti sets out is where we begin to apply some level of wisdom with an understanding that all these sentient beings are transitory, they're impermanent, they change moment by moment, and of course deal with gross impermanence as well, going out of existence, going on to their next rebirth. And while this isn't the deepest error that sentient beings are making in terms of holding themselves to be permanent in the midst of the true impermanence that they actually possess, it is an error that they make, and due to that they suffer. Notice for yourself even how much you try to cling to things as if they were unchanging, trying to hold things in place, denying their impermanence, denying that we ourselves even will go out of existence, as well as all the other beings in our life. We have a lot of denial around the reality of impermanence, and that produces so much suffering. If we and others were able to accept that fact, already some measure of suffering would be lessened. So we look at sentient beings in this second type of compassion through that lens of seeing their fleeting nature, seeing their impermanence, seeing that we all are changing moment by moment and eventually will pass from this life, going on to another existence, changing again, this continual process of change that we're all involved in. And then the third, the last form of compassion is where we observe sentient beings with an application of the deepest understanding of wisdom, which is the fact that all of these beings think that they're inherently existent. They think that they exist from their own side. They think all phenomena exist in this way. And due to that confusion, unbelievable suffering occurs. When we see sentient beings qualified by their emptiness, by the fact that they do not exist inherently, and yet they believe otherwise, this is where we generate the deepest level of compassion, because we understand that the other forms of suffering that they experience, all the varieties of things within samsara, are all due to this, are due to many errors, but this is the most fundamental one. The fact that sentient beings cling to themselves and all phenomena as if they did exist truly from their own side, by way of their own characteristics. And this is completely opposite to how things actually exist. If only they had that wisdom, if only they knew that truth, all suffering would end. So here, generate the compassion that observes sentient beings in the light of that, that they lack inherent existence, yet they hold to the opposite. And then formulate that great compassion, that thought that thinks that this is unbearable, that sentient beings continue to suffer in this way. If they knew the truth of impermanence, if they knew the truth of emptiness, if they understood why they were suffering, they could be liberated. They could be free. They could even attain complete enlightenment. Therefore, we must do this for them. They lack that knowledge. We have access to that knowledge now. We must be sure to use this opportunity we have to come together and discuss emptiness as a means to help each and every one of these beings. By developing ourselves, culminating in our own state of enlightenment, we then will be fully qualified to help them on their path. And it's for this reason that we are here today. Okay, wonderful. Again, good to see you all here this morning. Let's get back into the teachings where we were at last week and what we're doing with this perfection of wisdom, the last of the 6 perfections that we're exploring in this course. So again, the 6 perfections, we've already gone through the previous 5 at various points in time. Again, recall that the last one, concentration, is really the main platform through which we need to develop the deepest level of wisdom. Wisdom itself, of course, is perhaps the most important of these, simply because even though we might practice all the other 5 to great lengths, if we don't unite them with the wisdom realizing emptiness, we're never going to attain any more lasting goals. We will continue to be under the control of factors and taking rebirth and so on. So just to refresh our memory on what we're talking about here, going back to the very first slide that I shared on wisdom from Geshe Loden. Generally, wisdom is a mental factor that's able to correctly discriminate the object of analysis. Again, wisdom isn't always defined in terms of correctly discriminating. It means that it is discriminating and ascertaining its object in some way. But there can be afflicted forms of wisdom. Nonetheless, here we're talking about the unafflicted, the one that is actually seeing things correctly. And when this wisdom is conjoined with bodhicitta motivation, it becomes a perfection of wisdom. So the wisdom, even the wisdom realizing emptiness, is realized by those who are on what we would call the fundamental vehicle or individual vehicle of the Hinayana. They have to realize the wisdom of emptiness, but it wouldn't be called perfection of wisdom because, again, they don't have bodhicitta motivation. They have not yet developed that more far-reaching attitude of bodhicitta that we just meditated on. And then, of course, the practice of special insight or vipassana is the cultivation of a particular type of wisdom. That is the wisdom discerning the true nature of phenomena. And that's especially in this context of how it is being presented within the Lam Rim. The general way we would talk about vipassana or special insight wouldn't necessarily entail that. But nonetheless, this is the, again, deepest level of wisdom, most profound wisdom that we all need to develop in order to attain our own liberation, but certainly then to go on to attain enlightenment. The subtlest, this is a little quote that I threw in um, from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, kind of gets us back into where we were at. Last time towards the end of the class, we were on the reasoning of dependent arising as one of the main reasonings to realize emptiness, to know the true nature of phenomena. So this was a little quote from his book, On the Six Perfections. It says, the subtlest form of dependent arising is arising independence on name and base, where every phenomenon exists relatively or conventionally as a mere label of the mind. Because of that, it is empty of existing inherently. So there's a strong emphasis in the tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, who is the main teacher who started through his teachings the Gelugpa branch of Tibetan Buddhism. And this strong emphasis on dependent arising and emptiness being completely complementary and us being able to understand one through the other. So when we get to this place of understanding the subtlest form of dependent arising that we talked about last week, and we'll review those in a moment, where everything arises in dependence upon a name, a concept that we have towards it, and then a base, or what we often call the basis of designation, the basis for which us to designate a particular phenomenon through our conceptual mind. So every phenomenon then exists relative to various factors, especially the deepest one, which is the conceptual mind that designates things as such. They don't have the identity from their own side. Their identity is given through the force of our conceptual mind. So that's how things exist conventionally. They don't have any more lasting existence than that. They cannot find anything to exist other than this conventional way in terms of how they do come into existence as a mere label of the mind, Rinpoche says, a mere idea that we have about things that organizes and structures our world. But our world, again, is not structured that way from its own side. And because it exists in this subtlest way as a dependent arising, it's empty of existing independently, inherently. So again, this is the other side of it we're going to take a little bit more look at today. When we look at the next reasoning, we're only going to go through two main reasonings. The reasoning of dependent arising, just to review, had coarser components to it that, again, are easier to see in terms of just their coarseness, but they are pointing in the same direction of an understanding of emptiness according to this highest level of teaching that we are studying. So the very first one, dependence on causes and conditions. Well, those phenomena that do exist in dependence on causes and conditions, which is most of what we deal with in our world, our bodies, the sense objects that we experience, our minds, even ourselves. We are all dependent on causes and conditions. The I depends upon many causes and conditions, the same causes and conditions for the body and the mind and the karma that we have that created this existence, and all the various things that are involved. Nothing exists that is caused in that way, independent of its causes and conditions. And whether it be the substantial causes or what we often call the cooperative causes. Last week, when we went through kind of an investigation into how the mind arises in dependence upon its substantial cause, which is the previous moment of mind, and that sort of chain of mental moments that lead to the existence of a present moment. And then it also has many cooperative conditions, cooperative causes that contribute to that existing. So this is true for every caused phenomenon. Everything that exists has its main causes, and then, of course, what would be contributory causes for that the existence of that phenomenon. And then the second and the third apply to everything, whether it's caused or not. Again, there are some phenomena, a few that are listed in the traditional teachings, that are permanent, that are unchanging. They don't arise from causes and conditions. And remember, last week I pointed out how emptiness is one of those. Emptiness is a negation. It is a lack of existing independently or inherently. And as such, it doesn't change momentarily. The phenomenon that it's correlated with, such as the emptiness of the I correlated with the I does change. But the emptiness of I is static. It doesn't have any change moment to moment. It can go out of existence when I go out of existence, but nonetheless, it has a unchanging nature while it is existing. So when we say dependence on parts and dependence on conceptuality, that refers to those phenomena too. Well, what are the parts of emptiness? Well, we would simply say the temporal parts, the moment of emptiness when it was that phenomenon first came into existence, the next moment, next moment, next moment. Conceptuality, well, of course, emptiness depends upon conceptuality as well, because we have to discern the truth of emptiness through coming to identify what we mean by that. That is a term we use to refer to the lack of inherent existence. And that way it is a concept. It is our putting a designation of emptiness on the idea of things lacking inherent existence. But anyway, let's set emptiness aside. I just wanted to kind of show you that, again, these other two, numbers 2 and 3, do have an application that can happen when we are dealing with phenomena that are not caused. But let's talk about caused phenomena as part of this. So for the first one, I used the I. It's dependent upon causes and conditions. The I is also dependent upon parts. The I is seen as sort of the whole. The parts are the parts of that we think of as mine, my body, my mind, even, all the various parts of the body, all the various levels of the mind, different types of mind, sense consciousnesses, mental consciousness, and so on. So there are many, many parts that are involved in creating the whole. There is a dependence of the whole upon the parts, and even we could say to some degree the parts upon the whole. But for a phenomenon to arise, it requires parts, either directional, spatial parts, or the momentary parts that, again, temporal parts that lead to things existing. Nothing exists independent of parts. Now, in terms of the third level, dependence on conceptuality, this is what Rinpoche was just talking about in that previous slide. Through the force of our minds, and again, the minds of all beings that work at a conceptual level, which I don't know enough about, all the various beings that exist, but I would assume there's some level of conceptuality going on with most of them. They're imputing, they're designating, labeling. They're conceiving of things, even if it's at a very gross, coarse level. Their conceptuality is identifying something and having some way of referring to it, labeling it. It may not have language. Many beings don't have language, but they do have a concept around things, so that they then, live their lives, organize their world in terms of those concepts, where their home is, what food is, what danger is, and so on. The coarser levels, we would see these still operating in the mind of a being, even though they don't have language. So when we say designation or labeling, we're not simply talking about linguistics. This can happen in a pre-lingual stage, in beings that don't have access to linguistics. This is our way of organizing our world again. We think that things exist and give them an identity, often in conjunction with our conventional world and the other beings in it that identify things as such. And that's how things get their identity. Everything depends upon conceptuality. So again, this is a little bit hard for us to see sometimes, but this is something that, again, this reasoning of dependent arising, it does help us to actually be able to discern how things do arise, so that we don't have any danger of somehow thinking that things don't exist at all. Dependent arising gives us these three levels of understanding how the Buddha held to things having some measure of existence, what we would often call conventional existence. And that is good enough for their existence. They don't require anything more than that. Moreover, things have always existed this way. It's not that only when we come to understand that then they, exist that way. This is how everything has arisen since beginningless time, through causes and conditions, through their parts, and in the end, through some level of designation that our conceptual mind is involved in. So I did ask people, I think I gave the meditation, and Mary kindly put it out there on Venerable Rabina's meditation on dependent arising with the body. And again, she mostly focused on causes and conditions. But as you can see, even at that level, the coarsest level, there is already a little bit of an opportunity to see the subtlest level, to see that if things do arise in dependence upon causes and conditions, they therefore have to be merely designated. So hopefully you were able to use that meditation and discern with regard to your own body how it is incapable of having any existence that is totally independent apart from the causes and conditions that led to it being here. And therefore, a lot of our attachment to the body, all the other misconceptions we have around the body aren't really valid because they're working with a fictitious object, an inherently existent body, when in fact our body exists in a very, very subtle way, as merely imputed, merely designated in dependence upon, the base, and certainly it also has its dependence upon causes and conditions, its dependence upon parts. So again, these reasonings, you have to spend some time with them. You have to sit down with them and analyze various phenomena and come to see that there is no phenomenon that exists independent of these. Again, all phenomena in terms of parts and conceptuality, and then those that are caused in terms of their causes and conditions. So one thing, well, let me see if there were any questions. I mean, maybe open it up a little bit here. I usually wait a while, but were there any questions or comments on dependent arising? Because I do want to move into another reasoning and I don't want to leave any open threads, though. So I'm sure we all have some open questions about a lot of these topics. Anyone? Any questions, comments? No? Okay, so let's take a look then in terms of one of the things I wanted to share, getting into the next slide, is Rinpoche's talking about how this reasoning of dependent arising kind of does help us to be able to find the middle way between what we often call these two extremes. I may have introduced these earlier, or talked about them in general, but I think it is important to talk about them in the context of these reasonings. So Rinpoche says, when we understand this level of emptiness, of that things exist only in dependence upon imputation, designation, we are free from the two extremes. Eternalism, which sees things as inherently existent, independent of other factors. And of course, that's where we are pretty much abiding now. In the realm of eternalism, we are holding on to things as if they did have inherent existence. Recall how Rinpoche showed how we have that even appearing back to us, and we assent to that. We grasp at that. We think everything exists from its own side independently. And then we have the other extreme is nihilism, which sees things as utterly non-existent. Only with this middle way can we attain full enlightenment. So the extreme of nihilism, of course, is not something that we normally fall into without having done some investigation. When we begin to get these teachings on emptiness, we start thinking, well, I don't exist in the way I think I do. Phenomena don't, my body doesn't, all these various things. We might start thinking that we don't exist at all, that phenomena don't exist at all. Which, of course, it's understandable because we are going pretty far with our negation. If we really get the import of that, the reasoning of dependent arising, it's almost as if things don't exist. They exist simply because we designate them, of course, on a base. Like what I'm holding up here is the basis for a hand, right? It's got a palm and it has a thumb and it has four fingers. And of course, we wouldn't say that everybody who has a hand has to have all of these present. Some people have lost fingers or maybe even born without fingers. It doesn't mean they don't have a hand. They just have a hand that has a slightly different basis of designation. But nonetheless, from the side of this basis of designation, again, there's nothing that is a real hand. Hand is a label that we put on this. In fact, hand, the label, and what I'm holding here, or what I'm waving to you here, is these are two different phenomena. This is the basis of designation. This is what is designated, hand on the basis of designation. And that's the only way that hand exists, is when those two things come together. There is an appropriate basis, something that we all agree we're going to call hand, and then there's the labeling of hand, giving the designation to it. And of course, it has many different linguistic terms, and mano, and whatever, all these various ways of referring to hand that we could find in various languages. That doesn't matter. I mean, it's a concept that we are developing around this phenomenon, that this basis, which has, again, the thumb, the four digits, and the palm, the back of the hand, whatever. This is the way that it exists, in a very, very subtle way, as simply a designation, a labeling. Well, when we go to that place of kind of recognizing that things are merely labeled, or that they lack inherent existence, we might think that things don't exist at all. And that would be falling into the other extreme. That would be falling off that precipice, that cliff, that we think nothing exists, therefore we need not pay attention to karma. There is no me that gets reborn. There is no you that I need to have compassion for. The whole thing falls apart. And of course, the Buddha wouldn't have taught such a thing, because the Buddha taught a very comprehensive system of how we are actually to go about this process of developing ourselves into a Buddha and helping those beings. So we're never denying conventional reality. We're simply coming to understand the very, very subtle way that conventional reality exists. And it can sometimes cause us, by negating inherent existence, independent existence, by thinking of this very subtle way, to think that things don't exist at all. But the fact that we are putting forward dependent arising, that things arise in dependence upon factors, speaks right there to their existence, albeit very subtle. So the reasoning of dependent arisings is actually said to be the king of reasonings, because it finds this middle way for us. What we're going to look at next is kind of one that helps to get rid of this eternalistic view, by really going in there and examining the way that we hold to an inherently existent I and coming to refute it. And through that, we might sometimes think, oh, well, then the I doesn't exist at all, I don't exist, and so on. Well, then the reasoning of dependent arisings helps us to come back a bit. In and of itself, it can get rid of both extremes. But sometimes we need additional tools to kind of really work on where we're stuck. We're mostly stuck over here in this eternalistic view, because we've been adhering to this since beginningless time, as I pointed out earlier. So the whole point is that we need these tools to get us away from that. But anytime we start going too far and start thinking things don't exist, dependent arising helps us to correct that, helps us to understand, no, the Buddha says things still do exist. But as Lama Zopa says, it's almost as if they don't exist. And that almost is enough to keep us from being a nihilist, to say things don't exist at all. It's almost as if they don't exist. I think, I don't know if I shared this in this course, I shared it in one of my other courses, that Jampa Gendon, who was the teaching assistant at the master's program, he had a teaching from Lama Yeshe once. And of course, Lama Yeshe, as you know, was amazing in his ability to know how to speak to Westerners. And he saw how entrapped we are in our eternalistic view, how much we're adhering to inherent existence in terms of the world we built around us and all of these things that just simply reify that keep all of that going. He actually told in some teaching that Jampa Gendon was at, that Westerners should aim for nihilism and then just dial it back a little. I really like that teaching, because there is something to be said about that. I mean, again, don't hang out in the nihilistic view. Don't find yourself thinking, oh well, these teachings are just causing me to think nothing exists. I don't have to pay attention to anything in my world because it's all a dream, it's all an illusion. And when the Buddha used these terms, he said things are like a dream, they're like an illusion. They're not an utter illusion and dream. We need to remember that. But if we head for, that precipice, thinking, oh, I'm just going to throw it all out, and then I just bring it back a little. Well, how do I bring it back a little? I think the reasoning of dependent arising is the important way to do that, is to kind of see that this is what we mean by dialing it up just a little. We go back to a place where we simply understand the very subtle way that we exist. Only through the force of our own conceptual mind can we say that there is any identity that exists for ourselves, for any phenomenon. On the basis, on what I'm holding up here, there is no hand. Handness does not exist from the side of what is appearing to you. It looks like that. Remember how, again, I just pointed that out earlier today. This is what Lama Zopa says is one of the problems. We designate hand to it. This collection of stuff appears to us. When we were quite young, we learned what our little hands were, right? Or they said, oh, that's your hand. And you go, oh, hand. Then the label for hand seems to melt into this basis, and it seems to come from here now. Like it does have its own handness. But hand is only a label that we're giving to it. And everything that agrees to that as if it did exist out here is ignorance, is a fault that we are making. So again, the reasoning of dependent arising is Tsongkhapa, did a whole praise to the Buddha for teaching dependent arising, because he saw that this was really the ideal way to realize how things cannot have any inherent existence because they depend upon so many other factors. Moreover, they have to exist because they arise in dependence upon those factors. So it's said to be the king of reasonings because of that. So let's just review with the slides a little bit of this whole idea of these extremes that I'm talking about. So again, eternalism, the extreme that we find ourselves in right now, is the tendency to see things having an intrinsic reality. Again, intrinsic existence, inherent existence, substantial existence, objective existence. There are going to be a lot of these ways that we can refer to what that misconception is, using our English language and more labels. But the idea is we have to get real clear about what we are adhering to there that is part of this eternalistic view. Nihilism would be the extreme opposite, where we see things as having no reality at all. And again, the danger is that when we deny them having an intrinsic reality, that we would fall into thinking they don't have reality. Things do have a reality, but once more, that reality is very subtle. So again, the middle way is between these two. The middle way that the Buddha taught, Madhyamika, the ability to hold a view that is not in either extreme, is found through the reasoning of dependent arising. And of course, we use in conjunction with it other reasonings to make sure that we've gone far enough away from eternalism so that we aren't going to keep having problems. We're going to eventually be able to undermine our ignorance and attain the state of Buddhahood and help others to do the same. So, again, the next reasoning that I want to go into, and there'll be an opportunity for some questions again later if you do have some questions arising on dependent arising. This is one of the most common ones that's used as well. And as I said, this is mostly focusing on the idea of trying to negate this sense of an inherently existent I in particular, though we could use this analysis with any phenomenon. But the idea is we generally use it with the I because the I is at the root of all of our problems. It's that clinging to an I as existing in this way that becomes the impetus for us to have anger and attachment and all the other delusions. So in brief, I'm going to go through these in more detail shortly. The very first step is to identify what it is that we're trying to negate. I mentioned earlier, that previous slide, how we need to know what intrinsic existence looks like. As I said, things appear this way. When I hold up this thing that we call a hand, you can see that handness appears to exist on that basis. It appears to have its own identity, completely independent, certainly independent of my conceptualization. So we have to begin to get really clear about what it is that is the object that we need to negate, the thing that we need to get rid of in order to be free from our ignorance. So the example that I sometimes use with regard to that, and we'll go into, again, more detail on that point in a moment, is the example of a young child who believes that there's a monster in the room. This happens, maybe this happened to some of you when you were young, where you had some belief that there was a ghost or a witch or a monster or something that was in the room based on some film that you saw, and you were terrified that it was under the bed or it was in the closet or whatever. Well, this is an ignorance, right? It is holding there to be a real threat in terms of that monster, witch, whatever, that doesn't exist at all. And it's very similar to our ignorance, right? Because it's holding there to be something that is contrary to what is actually there, which is nothing. There are no threats in the room. This is a fiction that we've made up that is believing in that, and therefore the child's terrified at night, maybe waking up in the middle of the night often at any little sound or anything going on, having nightmares and so on. I mean, all of that is being caused by a belief in something that doesn't exist at all. Well, of course, you have to, understand what it is that the child's believing in, and what it is that, what do you think this monster is? You might even ask them to identify it more clearly so that you have some idea of what you need to refute for them. And then, of course, you're going to go about a process of trying to make them disbelieve in that so that they can have peace of mind, so that they can actually go to bed at night and not be terrified thinking there's a monster in the room. But if maybe you're trying to refute that there's something that you think is like the size of a lizard or something, and they think it's the size of Bigfoot, well, then you're going to have a different thing that needs to be refuted. You're going to have to clearly identify what it is that the child is believing in order to disprove it. Well, it's the same with regard to us. We need to know really clearly what it is that we are adhering to. Now, it sounds strange because we might look at it and go, well, if I've had this ignorance since beginningless time and it's operative most of my life, well, then I should be able to identify it really clearly. But it's a bit like, I think I've heard the analogy used before. It's like trying to make a fish become aware of water. It's like it's in water all the time. It doesn't. It's very hard to kind of discern some sort of differentiation of that because it's become a part of our being so much that it's so naturally embedded within our minds that it's very hard for us sometimes to delineate what that ignorance is grasping at. So they say this very first step is the hardest step, because we have to get very clear about what it is that we are negating, what it is that we are believing in that is fictitious, the monster that we think is there that isn't there at all. Of course, Lama Tsongkhapa, in his great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo, he has two main parts where he goes about refuting too much. If you're going to refute too much, then again, you could fall into the extreme of nihilism, or not refuting enough, refuting too little. And then you'll stay stuck in this eternalistic bent. So we have to find, once more, even with this middle way thinking, that object of negation that is between these, that is not going too far and is not going not far enough, is making sure that we find this target. Another analogy they often use for this is if you were in a crowd of people and then you look down and realize that something that you had on you was stolen. A thief had come by and gotten you. Well, if you have no idea what the thief looks like, you're never going to be able to identify them. So we have to have some way of delineating what this thief of ignorance looks like in terms of what it is grasping at, what it is holding to. And so there's a whole process that is set out for us to be able to engage in that, to actually get very clear about what ignorance is latching onto. Just like, again, with the child wanting to know exactly what it is that they believe is in the room, so that then we know, well, it couldn't be, if it was something the size of Bigfoot, it couldn't be in the drawer, we know where to look then, to delineate exactly what it is that needs to be refuted. So that's going to be the very first step. And again, the most important step, the one that they say that if you get that one right, well, then the rest of the steps go very easily. Determining the possibilities is the next step after we identify what it is that we want to negate, because we have to determine where it could possibly exist if it did exist that way. And I bet, again, this is a bit like with the child, making sure that if you know what the right object is that the child's believing in, well, then you need to determine the possibilities. Well, based on it being the size of Bigfoot, maybe it could be under the bed, it could be in the closet, maybe those are the two choices. And so then you have to show the child that it's not under the bed and it's not in the closet, and therefore Bigfoot, this monster that's the size of Bigfoot, doesn't exist, because the two places where it could exist, it doesn't exist. It's not there. So, even at night, you would go in and shine a flashlight under the bed. You'd shine a flashlight into every corner of the closet. The child would see that the monster isn't there. And it might take some familiarity with that before the child actually disbelieves that the monster is still there. But nonetheless, you've proved to the child by pointing out the possible places where that Bigfoot monster could exist. And you've then done the next two steps of analyzing to see if it's in the one place and analyzing to see if it's in the other place. Okay, so now let's pull it back to our reasoning here. If in the first step we identified the object of negation as being an inherently existent I, this me, this self that we cling to so much, well, what are the possibilities for that existing? Either it's going to be inherently the same as the mind-body complex, what we often call the aggregates. This was the term the Buddha used. This collection of stuff that this is the most common place or most likely place it would be, right? Because this is where we think I am. I don't think that I'm in the other room right now because my body and mind are sitting on this chair, teaching you. So I don't have the sense of an I being apart from it, but nonetheless, that still is an option. That is a possibility. So it's either inherently the same as the mind-body complex or inherently different, meaning utterly different, completely unrelatedly different. It would be as if I was sitting in the other room and my mind and body were here on the chair teaching. So again, these are two possibilities, and you might think you don't really need to look at the second possibility, but we want to exhaust all possibilities. I did have one student recently who asked, well, why couldn't it be both the same and different? And that has to do with the fact that, again, when we think of the sense of I, it's a unitary phenomenon, right? It has sort of oneness to it. Well, then we have to find something that is one that is a correlate of that. That is, if we're going to be, determining the possibilities for how that could exist, we have to be able to find something that is it. That kind of, we can point to and go, there I am. Well, again, how could the I be in two places? How could the I be both the same and different? Because in the end, it would have two different natures. So it would be kind of going in the face of this unitariness of the I. So nonetheless, these are the two possibilities. And of course, when we determine the two possibilities, we have to be exhaustive in that. Going back to the child, if you say, well, okay, the monster is the size of Bigfoot, well, then we look at the room and we say, okay, under the bed, yeah, Bigfoot could fit under the bed, and maybe Bigfoot could fit in the closet. If those are the only two possibilities, if that's it, if Bigfoot is hidden in the room, well, then we've exhausted the possibilities. If we show the child that not under the bed, not in the closet, well, then where else would it be? If there's nothing else for Bigfoot to hide behind, or, a space that Bigfoot could be in, well, then, there's no Bigfoot in the room. It's the same with regard to analyzing for the self. We do have to have that determination that we've assessed the two possible places, that it's either going to be completely here in some fashion as one with the same as the mind, the body, the mind-body complex, what have you. We have to find it to be a unitary phenomenon that is the true referent of that sense of an I, that we can point to and go, there it is. Or we're going to find it to be utterly different, completely unrelatedly different, apart from the mind body. Is there a third possibility? Again, I wouldn't say that there's a possibility for it to be both, because we're looking for one thing. And this is the sense of I that we have, right? It does have a unitary quality to it. I don't think there are two I's. I don't think that there's me that is the mind and me that is the body, or what have you. We're going to see this when we analyze for sameness, that that's actually a faulty consequence. That if we think that there's, more than one I, well, do you really think that you have more than one I? We think there's a unitary, solitary I. So the two steps that follow, of course, are the analysis of both of those. This is like, again, going back to the child, it's the shining the flashlight underneath there, shining the flashlight in the closet, and then you go, okay, we haven't found the monster to exist in either of those places. Therefore, this monster doesn't exist. And as I said, the child, it may not believe it immediately, but if they have repeated analysis, and that's what it is, it's an analysis of whether Bigfoot's under the bed, whether Bigfoot's in the closet, okay, well then Bigfoot isn't in the room. Bigfoot has left the building. All right, so let's go into a little more detail on this, because again, this is, we'll take a break after we go through this first point, I think, but this is, of course, the big one. I may have to even kind of interrupt it at some point. I'm going to mostly use the wonderful book that, since I don't want to jump right to something like Geshe Jumpa Tekchok's book on emptiness, Insight into Emptiness, because it's a bit heavy duty. But His Holiness is kind of a nice introductory text for looking at emptiness, if you will. Emptiness is not an easy subject, but nonetheless. And it's the book I use when I teach on emptiness, which I did last fall. I think I said last class that I taught on it earlier in last year, but it was in the fall, I think, when I taught on this as part of the Discovering Buddhism module on emptiness. So His Holiness says the first step is to identify the ignorant beliefs that must be refuted. You need to do this because when you perform analysis, seeking yourself within the mind and body or separate from the mind and body, and you do not find it, you could wrongly conclude that you utterly do not exist. Again, you could fall into some nihilistic point of view. If you don't correctly identify it, you could fall into that view. Of course, the other side of it is you could maybe not go far enough to get away from the view that we're already holding to, the ignorance that we're so much driven by. So that first step is so important because we have to know exactly what it is we're finding. He goes on to say, because the I appears to our minds to be established in and of itself. Remember, I've spoken to that a couple of times today and talked about it previously, last week's class, that this is what's going on. There's a false appearance. Due to the force of our past ignorance, everything appears to exist in and of itself, be established from its own side, and so on. So because it appears that way, when we use analysis to try to find it and it is not found, it seems that the I does not exist at all. whereas it is only the independent I, the inherently existent I, that does not exist. Because there is a danger here of stumbling into denial and nihilism, it is crucial as a first step to understand what is being negated in selflessness. Because again, the danger would be that if we are holding right now, the sense of I that we have is very much mixed with the I that is a dependent arising. There is an I that does exist. As I said previously, it's very, very subtle, it's simply designated on the basis of this collection of stuff, but it's very much mixed with the overlay of ignorance that we have and the appearance as if it did exist from its own side. When we are able to negate that that appearance is correct, we may move that away and there's nothing there. There still is, again, a dependent arising I, the I that exists in dependence upon imputation, what we often call the mere I. The mere I is still there. It's not a findable phenomenon, though. It's a designation, a label that our conceptual mind gives to that. So if we go looking for things and don't find it, when we clear that away, in a sense, we could say that the mere I is still a way of kind of finding some sense of an I, but it won't be appearing to us because nothing will be appearing to us. All that will be appearing to us is the lack of that fictitious sense of I. So we have to identify what this I is really, really clearly so that we remove that and we still have room for coming back around and understanding this very subtle way that the I exists. So again, this is the importance of this, is to find this uh, kind of razor thin edge of identifying the sense of an I that is far enough away from the eternalistic view so that we are going to negate it, but not so far that we end up falling into some form of nihilism, thinking that when we negate that, as His Holiness says, we've negated even the conventionally existent I, the mere I. So let me do a little bit more on this. Now, I've got a little bit more from His Holiness, and then I also want to share a bit from Lama Zopa and how he talks about this in his book on the Six Perfections. So, how does I appear to your mind? He says, it does not appear to exist through the force of thought. Rather, it appears to exist more concretely. You need to notice and identify this mode of apprehension. It is your target. It is your way of identifying what the monster actually looks like, what size it has, what dimensions it has, and so on, so that you can then know what you're looking for. If you don't do that identification, then there's going to be a problem. So again, how does the I appear to our minds? It does appear to be self-established, to set itself up. We have to be able to see that very clearly. So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's look at what Rinpoche says on this. He gives a little bit of a preliminary, just like we saw with His Holiness. He says, there is an I that exists, the I that is merely imputed on the valid base of the aggregates, the mind and body. But this is not what we are identifying here. In order to pinpoint the cause of all our problems, we need to clearly see the other I, the one that doesn't exist at all, even though our ignorance completely believes in its existence. So again, just Rinpoche's word saying what His Holiness was talking about. This is the real I. This is the language Rinpoche often uses when he talks about the object of refutation in relation to ourselves. The real I, the inherently existing I, the independent I. It is called the object of refutation or the object of negation, gakcha in Tibetan, because it must be refuted or negated for us to be free from samsara. It is the what we are adhering to that is false, that has to be negated so we can be like the child that goes to bed peacefully every night, knowing that the monster doesn't exist. We have to be able to find that peace that will be there when we know that the I that we've been revolving around, this false sense of I, is utterly non-existent. Then it still leaves room again for the dependent I, the mere I, the I that does exist, because it doesn't require any form of substantial reality. It's not, again, even though it's very much mixed with this false view of an I, it is not negated by that, negating the false view of I. It still can be maintained. Dependent arising can exist within emptiness, emptiness within dependent arising. So Rinpoche does say, in relation to that term real I, that perhaps that term means more to you than inherently existent I. All the terms used are philosophical and they may not be immediately clear, but still, whatever term we use, we must have a clear understanding of what this non-existent object is that we instinctively believe to exist. So again, this is the gist of it, is that we have to be able to see it clearly. Whatever label we put on it as a real I or an inherently existent I, we have to be clear that that is what we are trying to isolate and then negate, just like we're trying to find the monster and then show that the monster doesn't exist. So real I is what Rinpoche frequently uses. Now, why does he use that? Because, once more, he's not trying to encourage us that when we negate this real I, which is the false I, that then we think there's no reality at all. Because once more, reality can be posited as simply through designation, merely imputed. The mere I does exist. So he's not, by using the term real to refer to this sort of object of negation, he's not trying to completely annihilate reality, because that's obviously not his goal. His goal is to annihilate this false sense of an I, which is how we see the real I. Because again, we don't see things as merely imputed. I don't think I'm merely here through designation, through thought. That's just not the way I see I at all. Even though that is how I is existing throughout all of this, I'm overlaying this sense of a real I. And by real, we mean able to set itself up, existing through its own characteristics, existing from its own side, existing objectively, existing substantially. Again, lots of different terms that we can use that are these, Jeffrey Hopkins calls them hypothetical synonyms. Hypothetical because what we're using them to refer to doesn't exist at all. So they're not real synonyms themselves. They are just ways of relating to this false sense of an I that we are adhering to. So whatever terminology you use isn't as important, Rinpoche says, as making sure you've got the right target. That sense of an I that is what we're trying to, again, refute, what we think we know needs to be negated if we are ever to be free of it. So yeah, let's stop here. I think what we'll do is we'll take a little break. You can sort of let your head empty out a little bit so there's more room for some stuff. And just we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. So let's go ahead and say I've got 11:03. Let's just aim for 11:15. Yeah, because it just changed to 11:04. So 11:15, we'll reconvene, and I'll ring the bell here. So just keep your speaker on, and you'll hear the bell. Okay, I'll see you shortly. Okay, welcome back. And there are two questions in the chat box that maybe I will go ahead and deal with before we dive back in. The first one is, does intrinsic also mean inherent? Yes, I'd say these two words are pretty close to synonyms. They're obviously, they might have slightly different flavors to them. I just took a look at the online dictionary, and it actually used each of them as synonyms for the other. But what we're talking about with either of them is the idea of there being some sort of essential nature that is abiding with that. So in Buddhism, we would say, no, there is no essential nature. Things don't have anything intrinsically there, inherently there. Rather, once more, it's all coming from the force of our minds designating it on that phenomenon. So I would say, yes, these two, and this, we often use them interchangeably. Some of the other things that we talk about as these hypothetical synonyms for this object of negation might not have quite the same flavor to them in terms of, but they are pointing at the same thing. That's why, again, using different terminology sometimes helps, because then people go, oh, I can see it better, more clearly when I think about things existing objectively, meaning from the object side, as opposed to subjectively from the imputing mind side. And then other people might find existing by way of its own characteristics to more clearly, spell out what is meant by inherent or intrinsic existence. So again, it's not to say that all of these are going to necessarily be completely identical in meaning, but they're going to be pointing at the same thing, which is that object of negation, that monster that we're trying to describe, trying to get at. And then the other one had to do with the phenomenon that persons being seen in two places at once. particularly as Paramahansa Yogananda, seeing his teacher in two different places at once. So again, just to clarify, I mean, I can't speak to so much all these various phenomena that do exist. I mean, even in Buddhism, we certainly say that bodhisattvas at particular levels can produce emanations. Those emanations could be identical to themselves, could be of some other form. And then when you get to Buddhahood, that's all that Buddhas do in terms of relating to other beings. Everything is an emanation of a Buddha's mind. So we're not saying that conventionally those sorts of things can't exist. What I was getting at when I was saying this idea of the tendency that we have to think that I am here together with this stuff is within the scope of this object of negation, that there is an inherently existent I here. I don't think that I am in the other room because my mind and body aren't in the other room. So when I'm thinking about an inherently existent I'm thinking it in relationship frequently to this sense of I that I am, or that I'm referring to, this sense of I that I always think of I in relationship to the mind and body. I don't think that I'm in the other room. So I don't, I think it's a very different thing to talk about in that regard, because what we're talking about is how will we find this false sense of an I if we go looking for it? And so we're not talking about how can an I conventionally exist and emanate and do various things that might be witnessed by various people. That's all in the realm of conventionality. What we're talking about here is how is the I conceived of that we think exists. And the tendency, as I said, is that we don't think that we exist independent of this mind and body so much. In fact, they say that's an acquired conception. Some of these spiritual traditions that existed at the time of the Buddha, many of which still exist, do tend to point to some sort of an Atman or a soul that is a separate component of being that is apart from the mind and body. And you have to sort of be indoctrinated to that type of thinking, to think that there's something other than the mind-body complex that is you. So we have a tendency to very clearly identify the I in relation to this. And what I was pointing out is that and this is, I'm assuming, where some of the question is coming from, is when I think, well, I don't really have a strong sense of that I outside of the room because the mind and the body are here in this room. That's where I latch on to that sense of an I, is in relation to this. Nonetheless, I have to disprove that possibility. Why? Because I have to exhaust all the possibilities, as much as it doesn't really seem to hold much water in this sense of a strong I existing somewhere apart from here. Uh, I still have to search there. I still have to say, okay, if I clear away the mind and body, is it possible that that I is still remaining? That I is something that's utterly different, completely unrelatedly different, apart from the mind and body? So again, when we talk about these beings that have great realizations and can do emanations of themselves so that they can appear in two places at once, or go through walls, or whatever the case might be, I mean, these are all, mystical phenomena that are taught in a variety of traditions, and certainly in Buddhism, there's no shortage of them. But they aren't what we're analyzing here, is whether you could have somebody's mind emanating another version of themselves in another part of the world or in another realm. That's not what's being analyzed here. We're looking for trying to refute the false sense of an I. And that false sense of an I is usually arising in conjunction with the mind-body complex. That was my point. It's not arising as outside of the room, because outside of the room is not where my mind and body are. The strong sense of an I usually is attached to the sense of me, at least the one that we're delineating here. Again, the Buddha did delineate some other coarser versions of the I that could be refuted easily, but this sense of an I is the root one. This is the main one that we're talking about, is the sense that there's a real I here. And we only have that misconception generally, it seems, towards the mind-body complex, thinking that the real I is here in the room right now, in front of your computer or whatever device you're watching this on. Okay. So I think hopefully that deals with it. You're welcome, Vasanta. Yeah. Let me go back to what I was discussing before then, because I think this gets into a little bit more detail about this object of negation. So Rinpoche goes on to say, without thinking about this sense of an inherently existent I in the correct way, we can never overcome its influence on what we do. It may even make its influence stronger if we aren't identifying it correctly, because we think we've not gotten rid of it or identified it and negated it, but we haven't gone far enough. If we look back on a time when we were in a very emotional state, such as, he uses a pretty extreme one here, terror from a near accident, or excitement from winning a prize or being praised, we will see a very strong, very real I experiencing that emotion. And this, of course, is what the general advice is given as to how to make that sense of an I that Rinpoche is referring to here more prominent in our minds. And of course, the terror that you might have had if you were in a near accident, or even if did start to fall off of a cliff or something, and somehow, somebody grabbed you or something. I mean, those are pretty emotional experiences, and we can, if we are very clear in looking at it, delineate the strong sense of an I that's arising at the time when we feel threatened. But we can even use milder examples than that, certainly, that are in that vein of, that sense of an I being defensive. The one that His Holiness, we're going to see that on the screen shortly, advises is like if you've been sharply criticized for something that you didn't do, or somebody points out a fault in you that you don't have, and and you're become defensive. That's the strong sense of I that arises here. That seems so real, like those remarks from that person are hitting a real target, and therefore from that space of that real target, that's why we retaliate. That's why we say negative things to others. That's why we accuse them when they accuse us. That's why we say harsh things when they say harsh things to us. So again, this is one way that we can conjure up that sense of I and make it more prominent, so we can pick it apart from the other misconceptions that might be there, or just simply what exists at a very subtle level. The mere I is to make it stand up more, so that it becomes, again, more evident to us in that analysis. So you might have one that you've already used that you would go to that says, oh yeah, I remember when this happened, I really felt this strong sense of me being real, me being kind of established here, set up here. And that's what we're trying to identify, so we can knock it down, so we can refute it, that it doesn't exist in that way at all. So again, pleasant experiences are also useful, like he pointed out, of a time when we received a prize for something or got great accolades. In any of these things, though, don't go back to experiencing it for the sake of the emotion that was there. Always try to identify the sense of I that was being held up at that point, held up as something we needed to defend and protect, that we were afraid of losing, or something that we were quite attached to, and feeling the joy and the satisfaction of being praised and what have you. But don't go into the emotional experience. Just try to clearly identify, delineate that strong sense of an I that's together with that emotional experience. So that's the way that they say is the most useful. And again, it doesn't mean that it's not present at other times. It just means that it becomes more evident when we think about those times when we were in such predicaments or such situations. So he says, this is the way the I has appeared to us from beginningless rebirths, inherently existent, existing from its own side. Unless we can see the underlying hallucination between the strong I that felt that terror or the excitement, none of the various analyses will work. We have to kind of make that appear to our minds in a very vivid way, so that we clearly identify it. As I pointed out earlier, it's like trying to get the fish to understand the water, but we are swimming in this ignorance all the time. We have to make it more prominent, and we have to come to some place where we can see it much more clearly. Or else, again, we could end up negating the wrong thing, or negating not enough, and ending up kind of, as Rinpoche said, maybe even making things worse. So now in His Holiness's book, he obviously, in Rinpoche too, talk about this topic more, and you can certainly go to either of those books to pursue more reading on this. But in Rinpoche, in Lama's, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's book, he has this wonderful section that Jeffrey Hopkins, I assume, kind of put together as a study guide for working with the book, that gives you the points to go through in terms of the individual steps. This first step, identifying the gakcha, the object of negation. The first step is imagine that someone else criticizes you for something you actually have not done, pointing a finger at you and saying, you ruined my party, or you ruined, whatever. You ruined my relationship. If we had somebody doing that and we knew that we played no role in it, the strong sense of an I that we needed to defend at that time would arise within us. And again, you can use other experiences here. This is just what His Holiness put forward, or Jeffrey Hopkins, in that book. Use what Rinpoche says, a time when you felt like you were in great danger, a time you were threatened, a time that you were very prideful and being recognized for something you did, and you had that stronger sense of the self that arose then. So, second point, watch your reaction. How does the I appear to your mind? This is the most important thing, is to delineate that sense of an I that is appearing, so we can clearly know it and therefore get rid of it, refute it. In what way are you apprehending it? These are the questions we'd be asking ourselves as we go through that type of meditation. Notice how that I seems to stand by itself, self-instituting, established by way of its own character. Again, these are different ways of describing the qualities that are there when we think about this inherently or intrinsically existent I, that it stands by itself, it's self-instituting. And again, use Rinpoche's words if it works. It's real. Notice how that I seems to be real, seems to have some greater reality. Again, it does have reality, but its reality is very, very slight, merely imputed. Then going on to the next step, of course, determining the possibilities, we have to analyze whether that I that is inherently self-established in the context of the mind-body complex could have a way of existing other than being part of or separate from mind and body. So again, this is what I was just talking about in answer to Vasanta's question. The real point here about, we do tend to think of this I as inherently self-established in the context of our mind-body complex. This is where we think most strongly I. Again, some people might have out-of-body experiences or things like this that lend them to feeling like they're separate from their mind-body complex. I can't speak to everything involved in those experiences, but we're mostly talking about, once more, the object of negation we identified. We have to try to determine, if it did exist in that way, what would be the possibilities? We tend to think of it in the context of the mind-body complex. So it's either going to be part of or the totality of the mind-body complex, or it's going to be completely separate from the mind and body. Maybe there is this phenomenon that we would call like a soul or Atman in the Vedic traditions. They hold to it existing. Buddha didn't think it existed at all, essentially said it's non-existent. But we have to then refute that. We have to see, is it identical to, the same as the mind-body complex, or completely different from, separate from? Is there a third possibility? See that there is no third category of existence. They are either the same or different. And again, as I pointed out earlier, that's entailed in it having this sense of a unitariness, an inherent quality. That would mean that anything that we found that is equivalent to this sense of an I, that is identifiable as it, would have to be unitary as well. So it's either going to be unitarily the same or unitarily different. If it's both, then you wouldn't be unitary any longer. Decide that if the I inherently exists, as it seems to, it must be either one with or separate from mind and body. So we have to get to that conclusion, that these are the only two possibilities. If the inherently existent I that we just conjured up in the first step, that seems to be so real, if it is real in the way it appears, it must be either same as, one with, the mind and body, or some part of the mind and body, or separate from, utterly different from. We have a cat that comes to our backyard that is really sad sounding. That's what you're hearing in the background there. That's not my cats. So it's an unfortunate being that just keeps prowling around the neighborhood. I wish that someone would take care of it, but anyway. Analyzing for sameness. So, okay, the next step, if we have determined the possibilities either the same or utterly different, well, now we analyze those two places. Again, this is like the example of the child with the monster. It's like shining the flashlight under the bed. Nope, not there. Then shining the flashlight in the closet. Nope, not there. I've checked both places. Therefore, there's no monster in the room. So the first one, analyzing for sameness. This is the one way that we can do this meditation is by looking at the consequences. This is actually what this school of the middle way is called. It's called the consequence middle way school because we use these faulty consequences of our beliefs to show how wrong they are. So if we have these consequences of taking what we believe in further, then we would have problems. So we wouldn't be able to uphold that through reasoning. So it's a form of reasoning, but it's a very powerful one. So let's look at the consequences. If the I is established in and of itself, in other words, if it exists inherently in accordance with how it appears to our minds, and first, if it is also the same as mind and body. So we're analyzing for sameness. This is the third step. First, I and mind body would have to be utterly and in all ways one. In other words, we'd never have any sense of an I that's apart from the mind body, an I that is just the body, just the mind. It would have to be the mind body in all ways and utterly the same as mind body. Again, we would find that that's probably not how we experience it. We have the sense of an I that, again, it can be very, very different depending upon what it is that is the referent of it. That's kind of pointing to its dependent quality, how it is imputed on the basis of various things rather than having any inherent existence. In that case, first of all, asserting an I would be pointless. If it already is the mind-body complex, well, why wouldn't I just think of it as mind-body complex? Instead, I think of an I on the basis of that. So asserting an I is like an unnecessary level of labeling because it's already the I at the level of it being the mind-body. Third, it would be impossible to think of my body, my head, my mind. Why? Because the mind and the mind, or the me, the I, and the mind-body complex are one. They're utterly the same. So I would never have any sense of my body, my head, my mind. And then when mind and body no longer exist, the self would be completely annihilated. And of course, we can say that the person of this life is deceased, but there is still a sense of self that goes on to next lives. We always have a sense of a mere I. That would be utterly annihilated because it's equivalent to the mind and body. We would never again have any rising of a sense of an I on the basis of the continuity of the into another rebirth and what have you. So again, if it's equivalent to the mind-body complex, we would have these faults. Furthermore, this is the one I was pointing out earlier. Since mind and body are plural, right? Those are two things. Here's mind, here's body. Mind is non-material, body is physical, material. Then one's person's selves also would be plural. If I'm the mind-body complex, well, that's a complex that consists of at least two things. And each of those, of course, consists of many things in and of themselves. Well, then we'd have to have multiple people here. That would be the I that is the mind, the I that is the body, and even within the body, the I that is the head, the I that is the heart, the I that is the legs. I mean, where do you stop? You would have multiple people. But the other side of it is since the I is just one, if you have this sense of an I that is unitary that we're thinking of in terms of this inherently existent I, well, then the mind and the body would also be one, which we know not to be true. So again, all of these consequences point to some of the faults in our thinking that when we actually go in investigating through this process of logic, it doesn't make sense that there is an inherently existent I because what it is referring to, the mind-body complex, cannot be identical to it, or we would have various faults as we saw that would ensue. Now, I know that that process of reasoning is sometimes difficult for people. Another way that you can do this analysis, and actually the one that I'll post out on have Mary post out on the Dropbox, is the one that's used in discovering Buddhism. And it's more of an investigation, where you actually kind of poke around. It's kind of like putting the flashlight under the bed and in the closet. You kind of start looking through this basis for an I that we think is the same as, it's the possibility, right? One possibility, if it's inherently existent, is that it's identical to the mind-body complex or the mind, the body, some part of it. Well, then go looking for those things and see if they are equivalent to the I. Is the real I just your mind? Well, then you would have no way, once more, of identifying it as your body. Is there some part of your mind that is, the real I? Is there some part of the body? Is it the entirety of the body? Again, we see that we're dealing with multiple phenomena, and yet we're looking for something that is unitarily exactly the same as this sense of an I. And we won't find it. You can actually do that investigation from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet and everything in between, and your mind, your various levels of awareness, your aspects of your mind. You never find anything you can point to and go, ah, there it is. There's the real me. you know I was looking for you, and you finally appeared. Instead, what will happen is the more you look, the more elusive it becomes, and therefore the less there is this strong sense that it's there at all. And that's what you're aiming for with this step, is to really get to the conclusion that there is no real I together with this. Now, again, you might say, well, you looked at the mind, you looked at the body, but what about the mind-body complex? Well, as I just pointed out, that's a complex. That's two things. We have a sense of that being a whole here to some degree, but that whole that we think of as the mind-body complex isn't really a whole. It's got parts. So once more, if we're looking for a referent of the sense of a unitary, inherently existent, independently existent I, we have to find something that's unitary. Well, there's no unitary phenomena here. There's this mind-body complex, this combination of things. And even when we look at the body and look at the mind, we once more see that they too aren't unitary. So we keep having these similar faults. What we are adhering to is having some sort of unitary, solid identity. We can never find a true referent of it. It's only a concept. It's only a thought. That's kind of relating it back to the dependent arising reasoning, right? I only have this thought of an I in relation to this stuff. There's no real I on this in any way. It's just a thought I have in relationship to it. But you can do the physical investigating, or sort of, through your mind, investigating various parts of your body, parts of your mind. Can you find something that is that real I? Keep correlating it back to the first step, though. Don't lose sight of what you're looking for. You're looking for an I that, during those strong emotions, does appear to stand on its own, does appear to have its own sort of identity, independently existing. Gil's pointing out, can I help the cat in any way, please? It's a very wild cat. I wish I could. It just seems to disappear, and I'm not sure who it belongs to. I will look into it, though, and see if I can find a way to help the cat. It is somebody's cat, I think. I don't know if it's completely feral, but anyway, that's my objection to people having cats that are outdoors. All of my cats are indoors because of that. But anyway, we'll let that go to the side. Thank you for pointing it out. Um, so again, we have that strong sense of a unitary I. We have to be trying to find something that is equivalent to it, something that is exactly identical to it, because that's the sense of it. That's what we mean by an inherently existent I, is that there would be something that is its essential nature that we could look at and go, ah, there it is. Now, again, this can be correlated to all phenomena. We're not going to do that with this analysis, but we're using it mostly as an I, because the I is the what we revolve around, is this strong sense of a me that then gets involved in all these things, that then does various things that create negative karma and so on. So this is the why we are targeting this in particular, is because that's the misconception that's guiding the whole process. So we've done that third step of analyzing, and hopefully that was sufficient. I realize, again, I'm going through this in a rather quick way, but you can work with the meditation. You can work with these slides and go through these points. We'll be passing them on to Mary after today's class, so they'll be out on the Dropbox. We have to then analyze for difference. Again, we don't have an innate kind of conception that we are utterly different than our mind and body complex, but we have to disprove that, because that is a possibility. That's the second possibility. So consider the consequences if the I is established in and of itself in accordance with how it appears to our minds, and if it is also inherently different from the mind-body. Now again, the eye, the mere eye, is different from the mind-body complex, but it's not inherently different. It's relatedly different. It is a label being given to that basis. But what we're looking for here is, as it says there, that in these words, established in and of itself inherently, exactly how it appears to our minds. Again, remembering that first step. How does it appear, that strong sense of an I? Well, can you find something that is utterly apart from your mind and body that is that real I? Okay, so what are some of the consequences? First, I and my mind body would have to be completely separate. In other words, what my mind and body experience, I don't experience at all. Well, we know this not to be true, right? That's why, again, we have that sense of an I mostly in relation to the mind-body complex, because what the mind-body go through, those two phenomena go through, we go through. When my body is sick, I think I am sick. When my mind is cloudy, I say, I'm not thinking right today, whatever the case might be. In that case, I would have to be findable after clearing away the mind and body. So if we were to take the mind and body off of the seat that you're on right now, whatever it is you're seated on, set them aside, clear them away, maybe put them in the other room. Is there an I findable there? Am I still sitting on my chair when the mind and body have been completely removed? Then third, the I would not have the characteristics of production, abiding, and disintegration, which is absurd. Because we have a sense that we come into existence, we abide, we disintegrate. There are various things that are happening in relationship to this body. We are watching the aging of this body. We are watching the various changes of this mind. All the characteristics that occur that pertain to the impermanent nature of our minds and bodies would not be occurring with relationship to the I. It wouldn't have those characteristics. Fourth, the I would absurdly have to be just a figment of the imagination, or something kind of permanent and apart from, in an unchanging nature, because it's not changing like the mind and the body are, which of course we also know isn't the case. We know we're not a figment of the imagination. We know we're not unchanging. Each of us changing moment by moment. As my body changes, I even think of myself changing. This is me at, so many years. This is me at another point in time. Absurdly, also, the I would not have any physical or mental characteristics. So anything we think about in relationship to our body or mind would not appropriately apply to the I, because the I would be completely independent. So again, any of these will probably be enough to help disprove that. What His Holiness says then is, once you've gone through this analysis, and once you engage in analyzing in this way, you will begin to question the strong sense of a self-instituting I that earlier seemed to exist so palpably. You will gradually start to think, aha, previously this seemed to be so true, but maybe it really isn't. And you begin to question it because you've weakened that sense of an I through this analysis. Just like the child, you've begun to weaken their conviction in the monster by pointing out that the monster isn't under the bed or in the closet. They begin to entertain the idea that maybe the monster isn't here at all. Now that it's been pointed out to me that it's not in those places, well, then maybe it's something I'm misconceiving. Then, as you analyze more and more, you will become convinced, not just superficially, but from the depths, that such an I does not exist at all. You will pass beyond mere words and gain conviction that, though it appears concretely, it does not exist in that way. So we're dealing with, again, a false appearance and then the understanding of how it actually does exist. This is the imprint, he says, of extended analysis, a decision from within your own mind that this sort of I really does not exist. That's the whole gist of this type of analysis, is to get you to first begin to question that and eventually to refute it entirely, to say that that sense of I that is guiding the show that I'm so caught up in is fiction. It's something that I cannot find to exist in reality. And by meditating and gradually cultivating these 4 steps, he says, you will develop an ability to examine anything and everything this way, seeing the conflict between appearance and reality, and deciding from the depths that persons and things don't exist in the way they appear. This is the whole process that we go through of developing an inferential understanding of emptiness through our conceptual investigation, through our reasoning. What is understood by that completely decisive mind is the absence of the inherently existent I. That's its emptiness. Even though you used to believe in it so strongly, you totally understand the negation of inherent existence. Your mind becomes absorbed in that emptiness. Okay. So this is the main thing I wanted to get through today and really emphasize, is that there's a full technique that you can use. And again, we do start with the I because of its prominence, the role it plays in our going from life to life. Moreover, as I pointed out earlier when we talked about the selflessness of persons, we know that in order for the I to appear, there has to be the mind body in some way. We don't have a strong sense without that. So we know that this is something that we can already see to some degree is dependent. It has a dependent nature. There's no I that, again, will appear without the mind body appearing. So we already can see a little bit of this reality of the I in terms of its dependent nature. Therefore, it should be easier for us to analyze the I in this way and undermine that false sense. And that's, of course, the main reason for this technique to be used. So any questions on the technique of the 4-point analysis? Again, mostly used with regard to the I, the self. Any questions? No? Okay. Now, again, what I would encourage you to do, most of you, again, have Lam Rim books that you've used in the past, that for discovering Buddhism or other courses, or you might have His Holiness's book, various things, is to spend a little bit of time after this going through another person's explanation of it. Everybody has their own kind of way of doing it. I actually find, I'm not a big fan of Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Pabanka Rinpoche because some of it seems a bit difficult for 21st century Western minds to get into a 20th century monk teaching, or Rinpoche teaching an audience of monks. It's a little bit hard. The language isn't so easy, but I actually find his presentation of the 4-point analysis to be quite good. It's really kind of useful. I think at one of the Light of the Path retreats, Venerable Gyatso led everybody in that meditation, just reading it almost verbatim. And it's a really wonderful way to do that meditation. But again, I will also send along to Mary the one that's used in Discovering Buddhism, where you kind of get in there and pick it all apart and you go, where is that strong sense of an I? I cannot find it. Therefore, you're left with the not finding. You're left with the emptiness. And that's the important role of this, is to leave you with that voidness, that sense of you looked for something and you could not find it. Venerable Rabina sometimes compares it to like if you always kept your keys in a particular drawer and then you went in there and you looked and there's an absence of your keys, right? It'd be pretty, impactful because you know that it should be there. They should be there. And that's the sense of self that we have, is that we really think it should be there because we've been believing in it since beginningless time. We have to come to that conclusion that it's not there. That's realizing emptiness. That's realizing the lack of this object of negation, this thing that we believe in so strongly. So let me just point out a few things to kind of round the whole purpose of, again, of looking at this in terms of the perfection of wisdom was to be able to clearly know how we go about developing this. We develop it through these reasonings, through having an understanding of how things exist, how they lack inherent existence. So let's look at, again, one more little bit that kind of adds on to this, which is the understanding of what we call the two truths. Conventional truth. In the end, we come to understand conventional truth in a slightly subtler way. But what this is this is referring to everything that's true to our valid conventional consciousness. It's not really true because when we designate things, we also then grasp at them as if they existed inherently. But there are valid things that exist in our world and things that are not valid in our world. Conventional awareness is to be relied upon to know what exists in, conventional reality. Although true on one level, as it says here, it obscures the ultimate nature of the phenomenon. Why? Because it appears to exist from its own side. And of course, our ignorance distorts it more by grasping at that. Ultimate truth is really truth. It is the final truth, which is the ultimate nature of reality, the emptiness of inherent existence of each and every phenomenon. When you become a Buddha, you can know both of these, together. all the time. This is what we mean by the final state of perfection that we're aiming for through the practice of these 6 perfections. But even once we've realized emptiness, we will have a slightly different understanding of conventional truth, because we'll see that while all beings with ignorance are adhering to that conventional truth to exist in that concrete, independent way, it doesn't exist that way at all. It's only designated. It's merely imputed. It's merely, again, a product of all these various factors, causes and conditions, parts, labeling, and so on. So conventional truth in and of itself, a Buddha's, or I'd say prior to becoming a Buddha, you have a very different understanding of what conventional truth actually is. When you become a Buddha, of course, you're free of all conceptuality and you're only knowing phenomena by virtue of the fact that other people are imputing different phenomena in the world. And those phenomena are then, realized through realizing the minds of all beings, which of course is the skill, the ability that a Buddha has. But the two truths is a very important teaching in Buddhism. We went through this a little bit in the Heart Sutra class. This is what is meant when we have that wonderful line from the Heart Sutra, form is empty, emptiness is form, is that these two things exist together with each other. Anything that we establish as a valid conventional phenomenon through that type of awareness is together with its emptiness, meaning it never has even a single atom of inherent existence from its own side. Everything exists through dependent arising. Therefore, again, conventional truths and their ultimate truths are together. The kind of dependent arising nature being the conventional, and the ultimate nature of emptiness being the ultimate. These two are bound up with every phenomenon, everything that exists. Okay, so I think that's good enough for today, maybe. Feels kind of like I've said too many words, maybe. um, any comments? Any questions? Again, I'll try to deal with the cat. It's been a problem, but we just haven't. Every time I hear it, it disappears. And of course, I'm not big on setting traps or something like that in the winter. And of course, because an animal could get caught in there and we not even realize that it's there or something. But I don't know. It's hard to deal with these things. We just had a mini ant invasion here too yesterday on Day of Miracles. It's always so fun when you have these challenges on one of the big Buddha days, and we're like, oh my gosh, ants, how to deal with these ants, how to be skillful with them so that we're not taking their little lives. But anyway, this is the nature of samsara, right? We all deal with it to some degree. So, okay. There are no questions. I would go on and do a little bit more, but I really feel like we're all kind of baked. Is everybody baked? It was a lot of philosophy, a lot of terminology. So let me just do, while we have a few minutes, just a little recap again. So there are these two reasonings that we pointed out here, which are really trying to help us to undermine that strong sense that the ignorance is working with, the grasping at phenomena at large, but also, most importantly, this I, this self, to exist in this fictitious way, as if it could set itself up, as if it had its own identity, as if it were real. And the reasoning of dependent arising helps us again to really find that middle way, because we do adhere to things existing. They do arise on the basis of various factors, the subtlemost being that they're merely imputed, merely designated by our conceptual mind. And then the reasoning of the 4-point analysis was really to, again, begin to look at, especially with regard to this I, how we cannot find it to exist intrinsically. So it's a slightly different tack. It's kind of coming around from that point of view of, I want to disprove inherent existence. And then dependent arising comes around to say, I still want to, uphold and prove conventional existence. So I see them often, working in this way. And I think His Holiness mentions this in his book, is that you kind of work back and forth between these two. You work with your reasoning of dependent arising whenever you feel like you're maybe going too far in your refutation to reaffirm that things do exist. But then you keep going back to the reasoning of the 4-point analysis to make sure that you keep hammering away at that inherent existence, so that you, in the end, can completely refute it and still uphold that there's some level of reality, so we don't fall into that nihilistic bent. So hopefully this explanation has been good enough. I realize I'm kind of cramming things in to some degree. We do have one more class, and as a preview to that class, I will go through those little recap of how we work with the perfection of wisdom in terms of those supreme qualities. This is pretty repetitive, but nonetheless, I'm throwing that in for each one of these just so we're real clear about how we make our practice of that very powerful. And then we'll look at the vows of the secondary vows of the Bodhisattva vows that pertain to wisdom. I know Venerable Rabina did a course where she covered a little bit on the vows yesterday, answered questions and things on that, but I'm trying to go through each of the secondary vows in terms of the sets that pertain to the six perfections, so I'll do that next week. And then we'll kind of wrap up this course. In 2 weeks, I'm going to start a little course on Rinpoche's book, The Door to Satisfaction, using that as a basis for discussing some of the things that are in it that I think you'll find useful. It's a very powerful testament that Rinpoche gives to his own understanding of the practice of Dharma and how we might go about applying that to our lives. So if you haven't read that book, you might read that while you are going through the course. But anyway, I'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. All right, let's go ahead and do the prayers together. Uh-huh. Yep.
Venerable Rabina did not go in and dissect the vows. It
Okay.
was just kind of letting us know why we take vows, why we have commitments. So she did not go into depth, just so you.
Okay. Good. All right. Wow, I've gotten really fuzzy. My camera's kind of, it does this sometimes anyway. Okay, let's go ahead and do our prayers together. Uh, so as usual, bring to mind all the beings that we are dedicating for. You know, every one of us knows beings who are in some difficulty right now, dealing with obstacles to their well-being, some who are dealing with illness, some who are dying or who have died. And whoever these beings are, think that we're sharing this positive energy with them, in fact, giving it to them, wanting them to experience the benefits of this and to have their problems removed, their difficulties completely gotten rid of, and for them to have all the causes and conditions that lead them to happiness. So we start with that, but then we try to expand on that idea and think, while we're at it, let's give this to all beings, and let's make sure that all beings become free from all suffering as we recite these words together. May all beings everywhere plagued by sufferings of body and mind obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And then let's do the prayers for our precious teachers. Again, we need these guides in our lives. As we're seeing in these teachings, you know, we are working our way out of samsara, and it takes a lot of help from them. It takes their teachings in particular. And in fact, it's always useful to receive teachings on emptiness from guides like these that we're dedicating for and praying for. So as much as possible, we want them to continue to be in this world, to have good health and long lives, and for us and others to always have perfect guides so we can eventually realize emptiness, accomplish all of the perfections, and become a Buddha so we can help others. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then lastly, for Tenzin Osuhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Okay, great. Thank you all for being here today and for taking part in this class. Again, we'll have one more